All right. Welcome to Digital SAT 1, Module 2, Reading and Writing. And this is the normal difficulty level. My name is Vince. Let's get straight into things. So, this is question number 1 in Module 2. The 28A you see there is just because it's the 28th question of the test so far if you were taking this live. So, anyway, number 1. Due to their often strange images, highly experimental syntax, and opaque subject matter, many of the poems can be quite difficult to, I'm going to anticipate the word something like read. Difficult to read. And if I look at the choices, choice C is pretty good, difficult to interpret. So just kind of goes logically, right? Everything before the blank is kind of telling us what's going on with these poems. They're kind of complicated and weird, so difficult to interpret, pretty logical. And then the rest of the sentence kind of helps me, and thus are the subject of debate. Okay, I guess that sort of helps, because if they're difficult to interpret, yeah, they'd be, maybe more likely you debate about them because everybody disagrees what their meaning is. Okay, so word and context opening up here. Let's go on to number 2, another word and context. So Monica and others at Brazil's Institute are studying the stingray species to determine whether biological characteristics such as their rays, age, and sex have blank effect on the toxicity of their venom. And I don't know what to anticipate here, honestly, until I continue reading and I see this, that is, and it's perfect because, like, in other words, so now I'm going to basically say the same thing as we just said in different words. And this is going to tell me what the blank is. To see if differences in these traits are associated with considerable variations in venom potency. Interesting. So the right answer here is substantial. So basically what we're looking to do here is we're noticing that the part before the blank in the sentence, containing, well, it's all one sentence. The part with the blank and then the part after the blank. The part after the blank has more information, so we can start there first, and then we can work backwards if we didn't understand what the blank was yet. And basically, it's telling us to see, if this makes a difference in terms of how potent their venom is, and that would make sense logically to see if it has a substantial effect on the toxicity. So we're basically kind of saying the same thing twice here. So we want substantial. So just my tip for this is, if you want a tip, is, a lot of times when you read one of these word and context and you get to a blank and you don't know what's going on yet, don't worry about it. You're not supposed to. Continue to read and then work backward. All right. Number 3, former astronaut Ellen says that although she doesn't have a definite idea of when it might happen, she blanked that humans, and again, I don't know what's going on yet. She blanked that humans will someday need to be able to live in other environments than those found on Earth. This conjecture, so I love the word this in word and context. It tells me that we're talking about something that we already have brought up earlier. And if I didn't realize it earlier, which I kind of didn't, the thing earlier was a conjecture. In other words, a guess. So that would mean she is speculating. So we have a typical support relationship here. If you haven't ever heard me talk about this, when the sentences kind of agree, there's no shift. There's not like a however. We can assume that they're basically supporting each other and a lot of times just saying the same thing twice. So speculation, this conjecture, same thing. All right, number 4. Another word in context. Following the principles of community-based research, tribal nations and research institutions are equal partners in health studies. Okay, good. A collaboration between the Crow tribe and the Montana State University blank this model. Love the colon, because that means that now we're about to explain what we just said. I don't know what we just said because there's a blank there. But if I look ahead, the citizens worked alongside the scientists to design the study. Okay, so in other words, it would exemplify the model. Exemplifies means, provides a really, like a great example of. So it's like saying they're equal partners, and we're continuing to talk about that, and we're saying they worked alongside them. In other words, it showed the model, it exemplified the model. You know, it's basically saying they did the model. Okay, sweet. Let's keep moving here. Hiccups. What's the cause? Which happens when a person's diaphragm contracts? And I think even if we stop there, if you know what a hiccup is, you might be like, yeah, if I look at the choices, it's not beneficial. I mean, you might guess strenuously. It's definitely not smooth. I don't know if you can hiccup smoothly. Involuntarily looks pretty good to me. And look at that. Right after that, we have uncontrollable. Uncontrollable. That's the same thing as involuntarily. So these are contractions. In other words, we've already talked about. So kind of makes sense that if we end up with these uncontrollable, we start off with uncontrollable, and it's a typical support relationship. So that's why involuntarily works. So you may say, well, hey, Vince, there's a however there. Why is it a support relationship? Well, when we are referring back to something we've already talked about, like when you heard me talk about the word this, or if we have the word these, and we're like, hey, these uncontrollable contractions, we have to be like, okay, we already brought up uncontrollable contractions. So it kind of makes sense to describe the contractions earlier with the blank as involuntary at that point. The contrast is just because there's a contrast between the researchers who have struggled to pinpoint the cause and the neuroscientist Kim who actually thinks she found a cause. So that's the contrast. It doesn't mean that the blank is contrasting, the stuff later. Okay, so anyway, let's move on. Number 6. This question, I don't know why this is here, but it was in the first module. So if you already did this question, I guess skip ahead, but I'll do it again just in case. The parasitic daughter plant increases its reproductive success by flowering at the same time as the host plant. And then we determine it achieves this blank. And so this, the only thing we really talked about it is saying it's flowering at the same time. At the same time. So if we look at the choices, synchronization is a pretty good match for that. Again, we're talking about something we already brought up previously when we see the word this. All right, number 7. Another one of these. The contributions are blank colon. Okay, so now we're going to explain what we just said. Really useful punctuation mark. Anytime you see a colon or a semicolon or a dash, we're going to explain what we just said. This is useful because we don't know what we just said. There's a blank. Okay, so accomplishments include professor, poet, grammar book, founder. So it sounds like she has got a bunch of extensive accomplishments, right? Like she did a whole bunch of stuff. Okay. In the intercropping system, these crops form a blank web of relations, another colon, and then we see maize provides the structure, the vines cover the soil, discouraging competition from weeds, and the beans aid their two sisters by enriching the soil. Okay, so it's like I would say like complicated web of relations because there's a bunch of stuff going on. And in fact, the right answer is a synonym to that, intricate. So intricate web. After the colon, we read about all this different stuff going on that's, kind of complicated in a good way, but intricate. Yeah. All right, moving on to learning, reading passages. So we get a little blurb. We should always read the blurb because it just helps us understand stuff. So this is from Oscar Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray is looking at a portrait that Hallward, whoever that is, painted of him, i.e. Dorian. So we read this, he passed listlessly in front of the picture and turned toward it. When he saw it, he drew back and his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure. A look of joy came into his eyes, as if he recognized himself for the first time. And you keep reading this and you're like, he's basically in love with himself. He's like, wow, I'm beautiful. And I love it. So that's kind of the main idea, right? Like that's what we're learning about Dorian. And that's kind of like the entire point of this little passage. That's a pretty easy match for B, I would say. He's very happy with what he sees in the portrait. He's delighted by it, you know, and, he's basically like super excited that, that the portrait, I don't know, that he's very vain, it seems like, doesn't it? Okay. Now, this is an interesting one, I think. It's like, I always read the question first, which quotation from the poem illustrates the claim? So I'm like, okay, there's a claim here somewhere. And it says, often rebuked yet always back returning is a poem by Emily Bronte. The poem conveys the speaker's, okay, here comes the claim, determination to experience the countryside. Okay. So basically picture this woman. She's really stoked about like experiencing nature. That's my basic premise here. That's what I'm looking for. And honestly, I had a tough time with this one, because a lot of these seem like they're her experiencing nature. But the right answer, it turns out to be C. So let's kind of, by the way, one of those things, and I do this, and you should probably kind of think this way too. Uh, when I find an answer choice that I'm like, okay, this is right. And I'm like, okay, I didn't really see it coming, or I didn't really love it. What I probably want to do is be like, okay, this is the way the test operates. What can I learn from this? And a lot of times I'll see something I missed, or I'll just be like, okay, I need to make a conclusion that I didn't already know about the rules that the test plays by. But let's check this out. I'll walk where my own nature would be leading. So I guess that's kind of like determination. It vexes me to choose another guide. Okay. I guess maybe sort of that's determination. Vexes means like annoys me. Where the gray fox and ferny glens are feeding. So that's like looking at birds feeding. And then where the wild wind blows on the mountainside. Well, I guess I'll take it. I think I might have to, honestly, I'm sort of eliminating my way to the answer. Let's just, this is probably worth our time. So take a deep breath. Let's just slow down a little bit and see why the other choices are wrong. This will probably teach us a good lesson or two here. So what about A? Often rebuked, yet always back returning. So that's not really showing me, I guess that's showing me determination to those first feelings that were born with me. Okay, so the reason this is wrong is she's talking about feelings and dreams. I don't see anything about the countryside. So I'm going to get rid of A. And then notice B is the same thing. It's not mentioning the countryside. So I think the easy answer here is none of the other choices really talk about the countryside. And I didn't really love the determination in C, but it's right because it talks about the countryside. Okay, so beautiful. Moving on. This is a funny name for person. Mrs. Spring Fragrance is a 1912 short story. In the story, Mrs. Spring Fragrance, a Chinese immigrant living in Seattle, is traveling in California. Okay. Letters to her husband and friends, she demonstrates her concern for what's happening at home while she is away. Okay, so the claim is she's concerned. None of these show any kind of concern other than C, which shows a ton of concern. Don't forget about the cat, the birds, and the flowers. Don't eat too fast, nor fan too vigorously. What's going to happen if you fan too vigorously? I don't know, but she's concerned about it. That's the answer. All right, moving on to number 12. So we got another claim. The thing here is a 1890 play by Ibsen. Head of the main character is unable to freely determine her own future. Instead, she wants to influence another person's fate. That sounds kind of diabolical. Well, that's an obvious one, I think. I want to mold the human destiny. That's the same thing as kind of like saying influence somebody. Yeah. And the other choices don't talk about influencing somebody. Okay, so 12 is B. Great. All right, now we're in logical. I noticed that these questions actually were harder than I thought. And again, you may think these are easy, but we have to think outside the text and we have to kind of make it make sense when we see logically complete. And a lot of times there'll be a situation in the text that doesn't make sense, and we have to make it to make sense. Okay, so let's see. Some artifacts recovered from excavations on the settlement in modern Ghana date from the 13th century. That may lend credence or believability to claims that the settlement was founded before or around that time. Kind of makes sense. You got an artifact from that date. You would think they had to, have founded the settlement then. But then there's other evidence supporting a 14th century founding date. But if they're both correct, and this is what we call a paradox. How can that be? There's 13th century things that are dated correctly, and the 14th century founding date is correct. So how could that be? There's these artifacts that were there from before the correct founding date, which we now know is 14th century. Now, it may help. This is actually kind of a good question to take notes. So actually, let's do this. Let's not be lazy, Vince. And we're going to actually take a note or two here because it's going to help us think. So two things are true. One, 13th century artifacts are correct. And something else is true. The 14th century founding date is right. And I want to write these down so I can think about them without having to read the whole freaking passage again. You might appreciate that when you're taking a timed test, right? So both of these things are true. How could that be? And we have to look for a new piece of information that allows them to both be true. It's not necessarily going to be something that we've already read about, but it probably will be related to it. So if we think about that, we're eventually going to conclude that B could explain it. And I could explain it. It doesn't prove it. But think about it. If the artifacts came from somewhere else, then they could have been from some other civilization and the date on them is correct. And then this settlement didn't get founded until later. So the artifacts are from like way before. Boom, the 14th century comes along, the settlement gets founded, and now somebody brings the artifacts there. So you have to kind of think a little bit logically here, but it makes sense at the end of the day. So that's a good reason to pick B. Okay, another logical one. So we'll get used to these. If you're not used to these, they're very different, excuse me, than the previous SAT. But we just want to identify the things. So we'll take the trouble to take notes because we're good test takers. Or at least you are. Probably, I hope. All right, one theory behind human bipedalism, in other words, we walk on two pedals or legs, speculates that it originated in a mostly ground-based ancestor that practiced four-legged knuckle walking, like chimps and gorillas, and eventually evolved to moving upright on two legs. Okay, good to know. But recently, researchers observed orangutans standing on two legs and reaching for fruit. So interesting. So basically, what's our paradox? This is again where I'm honestly worth your time to write it down. I don't like writing things down either when I'm taking a test. I mean, maybe you like it. I don't know, but I don't. But I'm like, it's going to help. It's going to speed it up. So number one, it says like evolution from 4 to 2 legs. And then number 2, the orangutans use 2 legs. And I don't really know that, it doesn't really click for me like how this is a paradox yet. I just know that there's these 2 different ideas. Number 1, evolution from 4 to 2 legs. Number 2, or orangutans use 2 legs. So I'm like, okay, just got to look at the choices here. Don't really know what I need yet. But when I look through them, eventually I'm going to settle on A. And A makes sense, right? Because it evolved because it was advantageous. So we didn't really have a paradox here. I guess I should probably learn from this, right? Like it's not always that the statements conflict. There's just 2 pieces of information here. And the right answer will kind of make them, logically connected. It's like, oh yeah, it did happen. Everybody's right here. We evolved to use two legs, and it was because of the things like the orangutan. It was advantageous. It enabled them to like pick fruit. So the other choices are a little off here. They don't really talk about like how this would have been, a good thing. Or I'll just pick a choice here, like B. Did it have to evolve simultaneously with knuckle walking and tree climbing? I mean, it could, but it doesn't really, that's not very logical. I mean, the logic here is like we used to walk on four legs and now it's two. Why? Oh, it was good for us, like for the orangutan, because we could like pick fruit and stuff. Okay, moving on. Another logical one, another monkey. Monkey heavy test. So, in the study of these monkeys' cognitive abilities, they screwed up. They neglected to control for the physical difficulty of the tasks. Okay. The cognitive abilities of monkeys given problems requiring little dexterity, such as sliding a panel, were judged by the same criteria as those of monkeys giving physically demanding problems, such as unscrewing a bottle. Okay. So it's like, okay, some monkeys got the easy job, some monkeys got the hard job. And let's just write down notes because I'm trying to be a good role model here. So some monkeys got easy job and some got hard job. Okay. Because they didn't control for difficulty. All right. Well, what's going to make sense logically here? Let's think about it. The right answer is A. And the reason we like A is that if we were studying the cognitive abilities, but our experiments sucked, then we might think that there's differences that don't actually exist. And, kind of we have an example of that. Like maybe we think the monkeys that got the hard job are just like dumb. But no, we didn't control for how hard the job was, So it's basically showing us that, any kind of conclusion we make about what we were studying is very suspicious because our study was set up wrong. Okay. So I'm just looking through the other choices here. They don't really make any sense to me. But I think hopefully that logic clicks for you. It's like, hey, I did a study, but I didn't control for the thing. And you're like, okay, I can't take anything your study says seriously. Basically, that's our lesson. All right, another one, as DJ Khaled would say. All right, the increased integration of digital tech throughout the process of book creation lowered the cost of book production, but those decreased costs have been most significant in the manufacturing and distribution process. So again, I'm going to take a note. So lower costs, especially in manufacturing and distribution. So what does that suggest? I don't know. I'm going to have to look at the choices. I don't try to predict these. It's kind of hard for me. So I just like look and then I'm just like, all right, I get it. And I guess D makes sense, right? Because we just said that the manufacturing and distribution were affected more. Therefore, logically, the costs of writing, editing, and designing were less. Excuse me. Long video, voice getting a little hoarse. I'll keep going. But anyway, this is kind of a classic inference in terms of something that we can. It's like, hey, if manufacturing and distribution were affected more, therefore the other things were affected less. It's just kind of like logic. So something we can conclude, even though the text didn't say it. All right, now we're in grammar land. So number 17, public awareness campaigns about the need to reduce single-use plastics can be successful. For example, in Japan, they achieved a 40% reduction in plastic bag use after cashiers were instructed to ask customers whether they wanted a bag. So we can fill in the blank there before we even look at the choices. It's referring to the customers. The customers are they. because they're plural. All right, this one. Member the Cherokee Nation, Mary is renowned or famous for her contributions to the flight handbook, which I'm going to guess, provides, but I don't have provides as an option at provided. The other choices are just wrong. Having provided, that's just bad English. Which to provide, again, bad English. Which providing, all sound terrible to me. Provided, it did this thing in the past. It provided guidance. So past tense. No other tense works for me there. Okay, this one. Typically, underlined scribbles and notes left in the margin by a former owner lower a book's value. But, and it's this one, we need a comma before the but. The reason we do is that there's two sentences here that are joined with a comma and the but. So the first one is typically the marks in the book lower a book's value. Notice we could put a period there. And then everything after, including the but and after the but, could stand alone too. But when the former owner is famous, it can be gold mine. That's an acceptable way to join two complete sentences that you should know. A comma and a coordinating conjunction like the word but. So we do need that comma and the coordinating conjunction to join those standalone, clauses or complete sentences, or independent clauses, I suppose. The other choices are wrong for various reasons. For instance, C would be a comma splice. We cannot just use a comma. And D is wrong because if we were using a coordinating conjunction, we would need a comma too. And we can't just join two complete sentences with nothing. So value is wrong. Would be a run-on sentence in that case. All right, what are we saying here? We are saying that Watson and Crick won the Nobel Prize, but it is misleading to say that they discovered the double helix. Their findings, whose findings? We're talking about Watson and Crick, so it's their, plural. It's not a, that would be they are. So we need the spelling in C. Beautiful. All right, number 21, we're almost done. In order to prevent non-native fish from moving freely between those seas, we propose that a saline lock system be installed in the Suez Canal Bitter Lakes. The lock would increase the salinity of the lakes and create. So the reason we like create here, I don't know if you guys know what parallel structure means. Parallel structure means if we use two verbs that are both kind of talking about the things the lock does, it would increase and create. We want those two verbs to be in the same form, the same tense. So the lock is doing two things. It would increase and it would create. One thing you'll notice a lot of times there's a bunch of words between the verbs in the sentence if there's two of them. And then, so it's like increase, blah, 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 the salinity. And then you notice there's a conjunction here. And a lot of time, boom, that's where the second verb comes. And you can be like, oh yeah, does that agree with the first verb? You can go back and look at increase in case you didn't hear it. Be like increase and create. Perfect. Lucia of the university observed that alkaline soils have insoluble iron the blueberries cannot absorb, thus inhibiting blueberry growth. But if they were grown in alkaline soil alongside grasses that did aid in iron solubilization, could the blueberries thrive? Could the blueberries thrive? Well, it sounds like we're asking a question here. Yeah, it's D. And this is kind of a weird structure you might not have seen before. But it is a question, so we need a question mark. And then the only other choice with a question mark really sucks, like C. The blueberries could thrive. That's not very good English. It's more like could the blueberries. We have to ask it just like we would, if we were talking like could the blueberries thrive? And it wouldn't make sense for us to say the blueberries could thrive. I mean, somebody might know what you're talking about, but it's not good English. Okay, the classic children's board game Shoots and Ladders is a version of an ancient Nepalese game. In both games, they encounter good or bad spaces. Landing on one of the good spaces allows, right? So landing allows, we can say. We have a prepositional phrase in between. the blank in landing, and we can kind of delete it, and we can just kind of summarize that as landing allows. So again, this kind of trick helps us hear the agreement better between the subject and the verb. The subject in this case is landing, and the verb is allows. So I would, another usage of that would be like exercising allows you to get in shape, something like that. And I could also say like exercising on one of the good days of the week allows you to get in shape. Notice I'm putting a prepositional phrase there again. So anyway, look for this, be able to identify the subject and the verb so you can see if they agree. All right, now we got a logical transition. We have to see if sentences either support each other or contrast generally. So we introduced a bill to establish Martin Luther King Day. It didn't make it to a vote. He teamed up with Shirley and they resubmitted the bill every session for the next 15 years. Finally, okay, that kind of makes sense finally, right? Because they've been trying this for 15 freaking years. Finally, it passed. Wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that. That's serious determination. 15 years of trying to get that bill passed. Finally, it did. Hey, and it's still a holiday. So pretty cool determination there. Most conifers are evergreen. That is, they keep their green leaves or needles year round. However, not all conifers are evergreen. Large trees, for instance, and it's kind of like we can think about this however sentence and then think about its relationship to the large trees sentence. The large trees sentence is illustrating that they're not all evergreen. So it's a good idea to pick something like for instance, because that's like for example, giving an example to illustrate. For instance, something like in addition, we're not saying another thing that we already brought up. In addition would have to be like, there's many benefits. One benefit is X. In addition, another benefit is Y. But here it's more like illustrating with an example to kind of prove the point. Okay. Two more, guys. Two more for this video. Samuel was a prominent composer from England who toured the US 3 times. He was mixed race. He referred to himself as Anglo-African. And I would say this is a good time for in addition. Because we have this thing he's doing. He's emphasizing his mixed race ancestry. And then we illustrate with an example. And then we illustrate with another example. This is what we're generally doing. If we don't see a change happening, we're still doing the thing. So here we're illustrating, or he's illustrating his mixed race ancestry. He does one thing in the way he refers to himself, and then he does another thing in addition. So we're kind of like, hey, here's another thing he did. He's incorporating the music. Okay, final question. Note taker. Beatles. Who doesn't like the Beatles, man? This is great. So we learn all this stuff. Before I read all these notes, I'm going to look at the question. We want to make a generalization about the kind of study conducted. So this might not even be about the Beatles. We're just talking about the kind of study, whatever that was. And let's just look at the notes, but we're looking for like what type of study was this? So Lennon and McCartney wrote, they shared writing credit. Okay, some of the songs were not just one of the two. The exact authorship is disputed. We still haven't even talked about the study. Okay, now we're finally talking about it. They used statistical methods to analyze the content, and then they made a conclusion. So really the only thing that I was paying attention to really here was bullet point 4. They're analyzing the musical content with statistics. That's the type of study. This is not a generalization, even though it is about statistics. It's a specific because it's talking about like one of the two Beatles in one of the songs. Same thing here. This is a very specific detail. Same thing here. This is a very specific detail. But check out D. Super general, right? Researchers have used stats to address questions of authorship in music. Okay, that's a generalization for sure. Not specific at all. We love it. All right, this concludes Module 2, Normal Difficulty. If you get the hard difficulty, you're probably not watching this, but In case you're curious about what that looks like, I'll go over that in the next video. See you then.